Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, even though you said everything you thought you needed to? That tightness in your chest, like your words only made things worse. Maybe you've been around people who speak over you, twist the narrative, and treat loudness like it's proof they're right. And somewhere along the way, you started to wonder, is staying silent the same as losing? But what if silence isn't weakness? What if it's your greatest strength? The Stoics didn't see silence as surrender. They saw it as control of emotion, of ego, of the moment itself. And today we're going to talk about how to use that kind of silence, not to hide, but to lead, not to retreat, but to outsmart. If that message resonates with you, and you want more of this kind of content, there's one simple way to support. Just hit the subscribe button. Let's get into it. You don't outsmart people by reacting. You outsmart them by watching, by staying calm when the room gets loud, by hearing more than what's said and seeing more than what's shown. Outsmarting doesn't mean speaking faster or proving someone wrong in front of a crowd. It means understanding the game so deeply that you don't need to play it. And that begins with stillness. Not the kind of stillness that's empty or confused, but the kind that's deliberate, focused, loaded with intention. The kind of stillness that looks like nothing and yet holds everything. It's not silence born of fear. It's silence born of strategy, a trap disguised as surrender. You don't win by raising your voice. You win by not needing to speak at all. You win by letting the noise wear itself out while you stay rooted. When everyone else is reacting, you're observing, and in that gap between their impulse and your restraint, you gain all the power. Socrates once said, "The beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms, but the beginning of mastery is learning how not to respond to every term thrown at you." When you stop needing to jump into every conversation, every insult, every misunderstanding, you start to see clearly. You begin to read people, not their words, but their patterns. And once you can read someone's pattern, you're already 3 steps ahead. But why do people talk so much in conflict? Why do they feel the need to explain themselves over and over, even when no one's listening? It's not because they have something important to say, it's because they're afraid. Afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being wrong, afraid of the silence that follows after they stop talking. That silence is a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. Most people talk not to express, but to distract, not to connect, but to protect. And the more they talk, the more they reveal what they were trying to hide. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That includes filling every quiet moment with noise, with justification, with emotional outbursts, just to avoid sitting with the discomfort of their own inner conflict. They'll use words like shields, like smoke screens, like armor. But here's the thing. When someone hides behind too many words, it's not hard to tell what they're afraid of. You just have to stay quiet long enough to let them expose it. So how do you protect yourself from being pulled into that same pattern? How do you keep from getting baited into reacting? You start by refusing to play. Their game is built on reaction. Their entire power comes from dragging you into their drama, their accusations, their guilt traps. They want you defensive. They want you emotional. They want you explaining yourself, because the moment you do that, you're on their turf, and they've already set the rules. What happens when you don't take the bait? When you stay grounded, still, unreadable, you break the rhythm. You interrupt the cycle. Now they don't know what to do with you. You're not giving them the data they're fishing for. You're not revealing your emotions, your triggers, your weak spots. And without that, they're disarmed. Plato said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." When you hold back, you force others to reveal whether their words are rooted in substance or in fear. And isn't that the real game? To see the truth behind the performance, to read the insecurity beneath the arrogance, the chaos behind the control, the fear beneath the volume. Most people aren't hard to read. They're just loud enough to make you stop listening. But when you stop reacting and start observing, everything becomes clear. You start to notice what they emphasize too much, what they dodge, what they contradict, what they desperately want you to believe. But if you stay still, mentally, emotionally, verbally, something strange happens. They start to panic. And it's not because you said something threatening, it's because you didn't say anything at all. You didn't react. You didn't feed the fire. And in that space where they expected noise, all they find is themselves. That's when they become exposed. They speak while you say nothing. They start guessing while you're just watching. They spill pieces of themselves, nervous, unfiltered, while you collect every detail. It's subtle, but it's devastating, because your silence turns into a mirror. And most people, truthfully, can't stand to look into it. Not when it's clean and quiet. Not when it reflects back the parts they were trying to hide. What do you think you see in that silence? You see the fear behind their certainty. You see the cracks in their mask, the contradictions between what they say and how they say it, that sudden edge in their tone, the rehearsed confidence that's just a bit too forced, the way they double down when no one challenges them. Every insecurity starts to rise to the surface. Every hidden agenda leaks out. They try too hard. They overcompensate. And the more you stay still, the more they reveal. It's like watching someone talk themselves into a corner they don't even realize they built. Why do you think the smartest people in the room usually speak the least? Because when you're really paying attention, you don't need to interrupt. You don't need to prove anything. You already see everything. Like Plato said, a wise man speaks because he has something to say. A fool because he has to say something. The desperate need to control the narrative, that's the tell. That's the confession without the words. And when you're not caught up in your own need to respond, you can spot it from a mile away. But let's be clear, silence doesn't mean absence. It doesn't mean surrender. It doesn't mean you've given up the fight. Quite the opposite. It means you've stepped out of their frame. You're not playing the same game anymore. You're controlling the tempo, the direction, the gravity of the conversation. And the most powerful kind of control, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. You don't have to say, "I'm calm." You don't have to say, "I'm in control." Because the moment you do, you aren't. This kind of control is quiet. It's internal. It comes from not needing validation, not chasing acceptance, not grasping for dominance. It's self-contained, and that makes it untouchable. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And that's exactly what silence helps you do. It brings the unconscious to the surface, in them and in you. So what happens when someone expects a fight but gets nothing? When they push and you don't move? When they insult, provoke, bait, and you stay unmoved? That's when the energy shifts. That's when everything starts to wobble. You've probably seen it. Someone's yelling, flailing with words, expecting resistance, but the other person just stands there, calm, still, focused, not checked out, not defeated, but present, totally, unbotheredly present. And suddenly, the loud one doesn't seem so powerful anymore. They stumble, they double back, they start questioning their own message, because the silence doesn't match their script. There's no feedback, no counterattack, just presence. Why is that so powerful? Because in that moment, they hear themselves, without distraction, without noise, without deflection. And what they hear isn't strong, it's unstable, It's messy. It's full of holes. The silence becomes an amplifier, not of your voice, but of their own weaknesses. And that's when the truth shows up. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, but making someone else face themselves, that's a different level of intelligence altogether. Mastering silence isn't about holding back, it's about holding power. It's choosing not to react when everything inside you wants to. It's choosing to watch instead of argue, to listen instead of defend, because you know the real work is happening in the space between their words, and your stillness is what makes that space exist. But silence by itself, that's not power. That can just be hiding. If you're silent but unsure, silent but afraid, silent without understanding the dynamics at play, then you're not being strategic, you're being submissive. And that kind of silence doesn't protect you, it cages you. What we're talking about here isn't retreat, it's not avoidance, it's the kind of silence that comes from strength, from clarity, from seeing 10 steps ahead while everyone else is still reacting to the last move. It's tactical, like a blade you don't show, because you don't need to. So what happens when you choose that kind of silence? Not from fear, but from control. The entire balance shifts. Suddenly, the other person isn't centered anymore. You are. Their voice starts circling around your stillness. Their emotions start rising, not because of anything you said, but because of what you didn't say. That non-response. It becomes louder than any words could have been, and now they're reacting to you, even though you haven't moved. That's when you know you've flipped the script. You're no longer in their story, they're in yours. Why is that shift so powerful? Because unpredictability makes people nervous. They can't manage what they can't predict. They can't manipulate what they can't read. And that's the beauty of being quiet with purpose. It turns you into a mystery. And in human psychology, mystery is power. Carl Jung said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And when you don't react the way they expect, they're suddenly left alone with themselves. No script, no feedback, just silence. And it forces them to see what they've been avoiding all along. Let's be honest, most people rely on patterns. They say something rude, you get defensive. They push, you push back. That's the loop. That's the dance they know. But when you step out of it, when you don't flinch, don't explain, don't engage, you break the pattern. Now they're the ones on edge, because unpredictability forces them to check themselves. They can't gauge your mood, your intent, your limits, and that makes them cautious. Suddenly, they're not controlling the moment. They're walking on eggshells. What's more intimidating than a person you can't provoke? A person who holds their silence like a sword, who listens with intensity, who speaks only when it actually matters. That's not shyness, that's intelligence. That's someone who's already seen the consequences of every possible response and knows that sometimes the best move is none at all. Socrates once said, "I know that I am intelligent because I know that I know nothing." It's that kind of humility that keeps the wise from speaking too quickly. They understand the weight of every word. They've learned that careless talking costs leverage, so they choose their words the way a warrior chooses their battles, with precision. You've probably met people like this, the ones who barely speak in meetings, but when they do, everything stops. Not because they demand attention, but because their silence has already built it. That's the kind of presence you earn when you stop wasting energy on noise. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And the person who knows themselves doesn't need to chase attention. They command it, without even trying. And that's really what it all comes down to. Presence. Not just being in the room, but owning it. The kind of presence that doesn't ask for attention, but naturally draws it in. The kind that speaks volumes. even when you say absolutely nothing. Because silence on its own can be powerful, but silence anchored in strong, grounded presence. That's magnetic. You no longer need to explain your worth when your energy says it before your mouth does. You don't have to defend your position when your very stillness makes others question theirs. But what does it really mean to have presence? It's not about being the loudest. It's not about commanding with your voice. It's about being rooted, deeply, unapologetically, and unshakably rooted. Rooted in your values. Rooted in who you are and what you stand for. Rooted in your purpose, not just in what you do, but in why you exist. And when you're that grounded, people feel it. Even if they don't understand it, they sense it, and they adjust. They tread more carefully, they listen a little closer, they hesitate before pushing too far. Not because you've said a single threatening thing, but because your presence alone sets the tone. Why is that so unsettling to people? Because most folks are used to dealing with reactions. They're used to noise. When someone doesn't flinch, doesn't rush to fill the silence, doesn't need to dominate or defend, that throws everything off. It's like walking into a room with someone who's carved out a quiet kind of authority, one that doesn't shout, but is impossible to ignore. And that's the kind of energy that makes people second-guess themselves without you lifting a finger. Think about it. How often have you softened your own stance in front of someone who just had that presence? Maybe they looked at you with calm eyes, didn't interrupt, didn't explain themselves, and suddenly you found yourself rephrasing your words, reconsidering your tone, making sure you weren't misstepping. That's the power of unshakable presence. Socrates once said, "The greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be." And when you live aligned with your truth, no pretending, no performing, that energy becomes undeniable. So what happens when someone like that finally does speak? Everything stops. The air tightens. The room leans in. Because people know you don't speak unless it really matters. Your words aren't scattered everywhere. They're held back, sharpened, intentional. The silence before you speak builds tension like a drum roll. The silence after you speak. That's where the impact lands. People don't just hear you, they feel you. That's what happens when your presence carries more weight than your words. Your voice, used rarely, becomes more powerful than those who use theirs constantly. Why? Because scarcity creates value. Because people trust someone who speaks from stillness more than someone who talks from insecurity. Plato believed that silence at the proper season is wisdom. And that's exactly what your presence teaches others, that you don't talk to fill the air, you talk to shape it. But reaching that level, where silence becomes your weapon and stillness becomes your strength, it doesn't happen by accident. It demands something most people spend their whole lives avoiding: discomfort. Not the discomfort of physical pain or public pressure, but the deep, emotional kind. The discomfort of not being understood, the discomfort of being seen incorrectly, the ache of letting someone else get the last word, knowing it's wrong, knowing it distorts the truth, but choosing not to chase correction. That level of inner discipline, it's not natural, it's built, and it takes real strength, because real power doesn't always look like control on the outside. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like the person who could speak but doesn't, who could correct but walks away. That's not weakness. That's control so deep it doesn't need to be seen. Why is that so hard for us to hold on to? Because we're wired to want to be seen. We're wired to crave being right. Our ego tells us, you have to fix this, you have to say something. But the moment we need to be seen, to be right, to be heard, we hand over our power. Just like that. We shift from grounded to reactive, from observer to participant, and when you become reactive, you become readable, predictable, controllable. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's what happens when you don't master your emotional impulses. You think you're standing your ground, but really, you're being played. Because manipulation always begins with knowing where to poke. The more reactive you are, the more data you give away. You're giving them the code to your emotions, the map to your buttons, and they will press those buttons as long as you keep lighting up. So how do you take that power back? You start by killing the need to explain, the need to prove, the need to be understood. That need is a weakness in disguise. Replace it with stillness, replace it with patience, replace it with sharp observation and quiet confidence. Because when you stop reacting, something strange starts to happen. You start seeing, really seeing. You start seeing who's overcompensating. You hear the shake behind the smile. You notice the desperate need to be validated, the forced tone, the contradiction between their words and their posture. And you begin to understand that most of what people say isn't truth. It's armor, it's projection, it's their fear dressed up in polished sentences. Their confidence is often a costume, their dominance is a defense, and the more you let them talk, the more they unravel it all by themselves. You don't need to do anything. That's the beauty of it. You don't need to cut them off, outwit them, or argue circles around them. Just wait, just watch, just let the silence hang. Most people can't survive it. They fill it with words, and in doing so they reveal more than they intended. They start trying to dismantle your position, not realizing they're exposing their own weakness in the process. Why does this work? Because desperation always makes people louder. People who are losing control talk more. They get aggressive, erratic, impulsive. They make mistakes, and all you have to do is stay still, stay silent. That doesn't mean passive, that means present, unbothered, focused. Socrates once said, "Strong minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, weak minds discuss people." But what if you didn't discuss anything at all? What if you just listened, not to agree, not to reply, just to understand? What if your silence became the sharpest thing in the room? That's how you win without saying a word. That's how you outsmart people who think they're in control. You let them talk, you let them spin, you give them the stage, the spotlight, the illusion, and while they're performing, you're gathering everything you need to know. But here's the warning. Don't confuse silence with fear. Don't shrink into quiet and call it wisdom. Don't hold your tongue because you're scared. Hold it because you choose to. There's a difference. Silence is only powerful when it comes from strength, not avoidance. It's not something you hide behind. It's something you wield, like a blade, like a boundary, like a statement made without words. If you're silent because you're afraid to speak, that's not power, it's permission, and you're giving it away. So the question is, when was the last time you let silence speak for you? Not because you didn't know what to say, but because you knew you didn't need to say it. When was the last time you sat back and let someone burn all their energy trying to figure out what you were thinking? When did your calm presence become louder than their shouting? If the answer is never, that's not a problem. That's a starting point. Because now you know. Now you're aware. And that's where all power begins. True intelligence doesn't need to prove itself. It doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't rush to fill the silence. It observes, it listens, it learns, and it waits for the moment that matters. Plato once said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something." So choose your silence wisely. Make it count. Let it become the gravity in the room. Because in a world addicted to noise, the one who masters silence becomes a king. Thank you for being here, for listening, for thinking differently. Until next time, stay grounded, stay sharp, and stay unpredictable.